Hi, Jackie Strawn from HR Tactics here. I'm going to start off with a few questions for you. How clear are you on when an employment contract is needed? How about, do you know why having an employment contract is always advisable? How about what clauses need to go into the contract? I'm constantly surprised by the number of business owners still operating without employment contracts in place. I'd say on average each month about 75% of the clients, the new clients we bring on board at HR Tactics, are operating without employment contracts in place for their employees. And I'd say about 25%, out of the other 25%, at least half of those haven't had their contracts renewed in the last 2 years. As any employment lawyer who's fought a few unfair dismissal claims and similar employment law related issues would tell you, it's pretty silly not to have one, as it is the document that's commonly relied on to get you, the employer, out of a legal bind. And without one, it really does become he said, she said. So this month I'm going to cover employment contracts. We're going to look at the different types. We're going to look at why we use them, when you need one for each of your employees, and what clauses you need to ensure you're including. In its most basic form, though, an employment contract is an agreement between an employer and an employee that sets out the terms and conditions of employment that legally bind them. As a result of the contract, the two parties acquire certain legal rights and responsibilities. So what goes into a contract? Well, while there are many standard clauses that go into an employment contract, like the types of leave the employee has access to, the pay rate, the particulars of the role and the title, location of work, things like that, it's so important that you get crystal clear on the conditions of employment, which are outlined in the National Employment Standards, which are the NES, and the conditions of employment in the relevant award that your employee might be covered under, or if you have an enterprise agreement or any other registered agreement that applies to a particular employee or applies in your particular workplace. And the reasons are, I'll give you three. An employment contract can't provide for less than the legal minimum, and the legal minimums are set out in the National Employment Standards, the NES, or the awards, or the enterprise agreement, or other registered agreements that may apply in your case. The second reason, all your employees are covered by the NES, regardless of whether they've signed an employment contract. And lastly, I mentioned that an employment contract can't make an employee worse off than the minimum legal entitlements. So our follow-up, our next video that I'll do will go into a bit more detail around the list of clauses that we really recommend employment contracts include, and it's about giving you the maximum protection if the employment relationship sours. But for now, the most important points for you to understand are those that I've just mentioned. So let's jump into the types of employment contracts. In Australia, you can have essentially two types initially. The first one would be an open-ended employment contract. So that's where the length of time the employee is to be employed is unspecified because their position will be ongoing. A fixed-term employment contract is the other one. So that's where the length of time the employee is to be employed is specified and it has an end date. So that's a fixed-term employment contract. But from there, in deciding which contract is needed for your employee, it will depend on their type of employment, or their employment status, as some refer to it as. So that would be, are they full-time, Are they part-time or are they casual? And just to throw a spanner into the works, there are some other employment types outlined in some modern awards, which are things like shift worker, daily hire employee, and weekly hire employee. So again, go back to the awards, the relevant awards for your employee or business, and make sure that you know what employment type you can choose amongst. So in next week's email, I will outline why and when you need an employment contract for each of your employees, and really what you're risking if you don't have one. But for now, if you don't have an employment contract, or if you're unsure whether yours are still compliant, contact us and we can let you know how we can help.